My name is Alex Turner, a 28-year-old software engineer from Austin, Texas. After years of grinding away at a tech startup, I decided to take a much-needed break. My buddy Jake and I planned a cross-country road trip to Los Angeles, hoping to relive some of our college adventures and maybe find some clarity along the way. Jake and I have been inseparable since freshman year. He's the outgoing yin to my introspective yang. On our second day, we stopped at a rundown diner off Route 66. The place had an eerie stillness to it, the kind of stillness that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. We were halfway through a conversation about the best music for a road trip when an elderly man shuffled over to our table. He looked frail, with deep-set eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. He leaned in, his voice a raspy whisper. "Beware of those who cannot speak. They often have the most to say." Jake laughed it off, and I tried to smile, but something about the way the man looked at me made my skin crawl. His words lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. A few hours later, we were back on the road, the hum of the tires on the asphalt lulling me into a daze. Jake was behind the wheel, singing along to some old rock tune, when we saw her. A young woman standing on the side of the road, her thumb out, looking for a ride. She was wearing a long, flowing dress, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Jake, always the adventurous one, convinced me to pull over. She climbed into the back seat without a word. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to make small talk. "Where you headed?" I asked, but she just stared out the window, her face expressionless. Jake tried too, cracking jokes and asking questions, but she remained silent, her gaze fixed on something we couldn't see. I remember thinking it was odd. Most hitchhikers at least tried to make conversation. There was something unsettling about her silence, an emptiness that filled the car. That night we checked into a cheap motel, the kind of place where the neon sign buzzes and the wallpaper is peeling. The woman followed us into the lobby, her footsteps soft, almost imperceptible. When we turned to get our room keys, she was gone. I tried to brush it off, but when I got to our room, I found her sunglasses on my bed. They were strange, no lenses, just empty frames. A chill ran down my spine. Jake thought it was some kind of prank, but I wasn't so sure. The next few days were a blur of highways, cheap motels, and roadside attractions. But no matter where we went, we kept seeing her. In crowds at gas stations, standing by the road, always watching. At a gas station off Route 12, Jake swore he saw her reflected in the mirror behind me, but when I turned, there was no one there. My nerves were shot, and I could tell Jake was starting to feel it too, though he'd never admit it. He tried to stay upbeat, but the tension was growing between us, a silent, unspoken fear that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. We took a detour onto an old road to make up time. The GPS had been acting up, and Jake thought it would be a shortcut. The road was desolate, lined with skeletal trees, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. A sudden feeling of dread washed over me, a cold certainty that we shouldn't be there. As we rounded a bend, we saw it, a memorial site by the side of the road, fresh flowers laid at the base of a wooden cross. I felt my stomach drop when I saw the photo attached to the cross. It was her, the same woman who had been following us. The dates on the memorial indicated she had died exactly 1 year ago to the day. My hands were trembling as I pointed it out to Jake. He went pale, his usual bravado gone. "This isn't real," he muttered, shaking his head. But it was real. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and something else. Something metallic, like blood. I knew then that we had to find out who she was, why she was following us. There was no escaping it. We drove into the nearest town and found the local sheriff's office. The deputy listened to our story, his expression shifting from disbelief to something else, something like fear. He told us that the woman had died in a hit and run near that very spot. The driver was never found. As we left the station, I mentioned the elderly man at the diner, the one who had warned us. Jake looked at me, puzzled. "What man?" he asked. My heart skipped a beat. He didn't remember the man. It was like he had never been there. That night, I scrolled through the photos on my phone, desperate for answers. My breath caught in my throat when I saw them. the elderly man and the woman, faint but unmistakable, standing in the background of several shots. They were always there, together, watching us. I realized then that they were connected, their fates intertwined, trying to convey a message. The woman wasn't just a lost soul. She was seeking justice, closure for a life cut short. And the man, he was her voice, the one who spoke when she could not. I don't know if we gave her the closure she needed. Maybe we were just witnesses to a story that had to be told. But as we finally made our way to Los Angeles, the weight that had been pressing down on me seemed to lift. The road stretched out before us, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. Jake and I didn't talk much about what happened. Some things are better left unsaid. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the shadows grow long, I hear the man's voice in my head, a whisper that won't quite fade. Beware of those who cannot speak. They often have the most to say. Maybe he was right. Maybe some stories are meant to be heard, even if the words are never spoken. Story 2. My name is Alex Thompson, a 32-year-old freelance photographer from Denver. After landing a gig to capture the autumn landscapes of New England, I decided to make a road trip out of it, hoping the long drive would also help me process the recent loss of my father. The idea of winding through the country, with nothing but my thoughts and my camera, felt like the kind of therapy I needed. On the second day, I stopped at a gas station off Route 12. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your skin just enough to make you feel alive. I was refueling when a man approached me. He was older, his clothes worn, and his eyes had that far-off look like he'd seen too much. Without any introduction, he said, "You shouldn't travel alone at night." He handed me a worn-out map, the paper soft with age, and marked several places with a shaky hand. "Avoid these," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could ask anything, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the building. I stood there, staring at the map, a strange unease settling in my chest. That evening, as I drove deeper into the woods, the radio started acting up. Static crackled through the speakers, followed by odd transmissions, whispers that seemed to weave in and out of the noise. I turned the dial, trying to find a clear station, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent, especially as I passed through heavily wooded areas. It felt like someone, or something, was trying to communicate, but the words were just out of reach. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. It was then that I saw it, a figure in the back seat. My heart lurched, and I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop on the empty road. My breath came in short gasps as I turned around, but the back seat was empty. The only thing that remained was a cold chill that seemed to seep into my bones. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was my grief playing tricks on me. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, enveloping the road. My GPS started glitching, the screen flickering before rerouting me in circles. I passed the same crooked mailbox 3 times, the same twisted oak tree, the same rusted sign that read, "Welcome." It felt like I was trapped in a loop, the fog growing thicker with each pass. Panic bubbled up inside me, my hands trembling as I gripped the wheel. The world outside the car seemed to close in, the fog swallowing everything but the narrow stretch of road ahead. Eventually, I stumbled upon a town, or what was left of one. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows dark and hollow. The air was thick with silence, an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I stepped out of the car, my camera slung over my shoulder, and walked down the main street. My footsteps echoed, the only sound in the otherwise empty town. I could have sworn I heard distant footsteps behind me, but every time I turned, there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. Desperate to find a way out, I remembered the map the stranger had given me. I pulled it from the passenger seat, the paper soft and fragile in my hands. There was an unmarked path, a winding road that led away from the town. I followed it, my heart pounding with every turn, the fog slowly beginning to lift. The whispers on the radio faded, replaced by the steady hum of static, and I finally broke free from the fog's grasp. Later, when I reached a small diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town, I showed the map to a waitress. Her eyes widened, her face paling as she looked at the places marked. She told me that the area was known for a series of disappearances back in the 1950s, people who had driven through and were never seen again. She pointed to the man on the map, sketched faintly in the corner. "They say he was one of them," she said, her voice barely a whisper, trying to guide others away from the same fate. I left the diner, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. The stranger's outdated clothes, his worn-out map, it all made sense now. He wasn't just a man, he was a ghost, a remnant of those lost to the fog. He had saved me, guided me away from whatever fate had befallen the others. As I continued my journey, the autumn leaves swirling around me, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude and a lingering chill that reminded me of just how close I had come to vanishing, like so many before me. Story 3. I'm Lisa Martinez, a 27-year-old nurse from San Francisco. After months of grueling shifts, my best friend Mia and I decided to take a much-needed road trip to a music festival in Oregon. It felt like the perfect escape. Music, laughter, and miles of open road. We packed up Mia's old car, loaded with snacks and playlists, and set off with the excitement of freedom buzzing between us. The first day was perfect. We sang along to our favorite songs, stopped at quirky roadside diners, and talked about everything and nothing. But on the second day, things started to go wrong. We hit an unexpected road closure, the kind that looked like it had been set up recently. The detour sign pointed us to a narrow road that wound its way through dense woods. Mia, always the adventurous one, shrugged and said, "Let's do it. How bad can it be?" The road was rough, the kind that made the car bounce and rattle. The trees grew thicker, their branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. Our phones lost signal, and the map app failed to load. We laughed it off at first, but as the miles stretched on, the humor faded. The woods seemed to close in around us, the air growing heavier. There was something about the stillness that made my skin prickle, like we were being watched. As we drove, we started noticing strange symbols carved into the trees and painted on rocks by the roadside. At first, they were simple marks, circles and lines, but they grew more elaborate the further we went. Mia slowed the car, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of them. "Probably just kids messing around," she said, her voice a little too casual. But I could see the unease in her eyes, a flicker of doubt she tried to hide. We stopped when we saw a man standing by the side of the road. He looked out of place, dressed in worn clothes that seemed decades old. He waved us down, and Mia rolled down her window. "You two shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Turn back before sunset." I leaned forward, my heart pounding. "Why? What's out here?" He shook his head, his gaze shifting to the woods. "Just turn back," he repeated, and without another word he walked away, disappearing into the trees. Mia and I exchanged a look, a silent question hanging between us. But Mia, always the brave one, shrugged it off. "He's probably just trying to scare us," she said, her voice filled with forced bravado. We kept driving, but the tension in the car was palpable. The sun dipped lower in the sky, the light filtering through the trees in long golden beams. And then, without warning, the car sputtered. The engine coughed and died, leaving us in silence. Mia turned the key, her knuckles white, but the engine wouldn't start. "Come on, not now," she muttered, her voice edged with panic. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. We were stranded, miles from anywhere, with no signal and no way to call for help. As dusk settled in, a sound drifted through the woods, a low rhythmic chanting. It was faint at first, almost like the wind, but it grew louder, closer. Shadows moved between the trees, flickering at the edges of my vision. My breath quickened, my hands trembling as I gripped the door handle. "Mia, do you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her face pale. The chanting grew louder, a chorus of voices that seemed to surround us, coming from all directions. The shadows drew closer, figures moving just beyond the tree line. We locked the doors, huddling in the car as the figures emerged from the woods. They were cloaked, their faces hidden, their movements slow and deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, my eyes darting around, looking for any way out. The chanting was deafening now, a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the ground, through my bones. I closed my eyes, fear clawing at my throat. Suddenly the darkness was pierced by headlights. A blinding light flooded the road and the figures froze. The chanting stopped, the silence almost as terrifying as the noise had been. A car pulled up beside us, and a man in a park ranger uniform stepped out. He shone his flashlight towards the woods, and just like that, the figures were gone. Vanished into the night as if they had never been there. He knocked on our window, his expression grave. "You two need to leave, now." We didn't need to be told twice. The ranger helped us get the car started, and we followed him back to the main road. My hands were still shaking, my breath coming in shallow gasps. As we reached the highway, the ranger pulled over, and we rolled down our window. "What was that?" Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper. The ranger shook his head. "This area, it's known for strange happenings. There was a cult out here decades ago. They vanished, but people still see things, hear things. You're lucky I found you." We drove in silence after that, the weight of his words hanging between us. The symbols, the chanting, the figures in the woods, it all felt like a bad dream, something too surreal to be real. But the fear was real. The cold that had settled deep in my bones was real. Mia tried to make a joke, to lighten the mood, but her voice cracked, and she fell silent. We both knew we had come too close to something we didn't understand, something that had been waiting in those woods. When we finally reached the festival, the music and laughter felt distant, like we were watching it all from behind a glass. The joy that had filled the car at the start of our trip was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that some places are meant to be left alone. And as we stood there, surrounded by people, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been given a warning, one that we were lucky to have escaped. Story 4. I'm Jenna Olson, a 26-year-old nurse from Minneapolis, Minnesota. After months of pandemic stress, my fiancé Michael and I decided to take a camping trip to reconnect before our upcoming wedding. We chose Lake Mirage, a secluded spot known for its tranquility. It seemed like the perfect place to escape from the noise of our lives, to breathe in the crisp autumn air and just be together. When we arrived, something was wrong. The lake, which was supposed to be the centerpiece of this beautiful campsite, was gone. Completely dry. The boat docks led out to nothing but cracked earth, split and parched under the late September sun. Michael and I exchanged a confused look. We checked the map again, certain we had the right place, but the lake that should have been shimmering before us was nowhere to be found. We drove into the nearest town, a few miles away, to ask the locals. They looked puzzled when we mentioned the missing lake. One old man shook his head and mumbled something about nature playing tricks. It felt off, like they knew more than they were letting on. We decided to stay anyway. The campground was empty, just us and the silence of the woods. We set up our tent by the dried lake bed, trying to make the best of the strange situation. As night fell, the air grew colder than expected, and the silence seemed to deepen, pressing in around us. It was almost suffocating. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of splashing. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard laughter, children laughing, the unmistakable sound of water lapping against the shore. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked out towards the empty lake. There was nothing there, just darkness and dry earth. Michael stirred beside me, and I shook him awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his eyes wide with confusion. "It sounds like children playing, he said, his voice barely audible. A shiver ran down my spine despite the warm night. The next morning we tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves that we must have imagined it. Michael went to get something from the camper, and when he came back, he was holding an old Polaroid. "Look at this," he said, his brow furrowed. The photo was of a couple standing by the lake, smiling at the camera. The woman looked just like me, and the man could have been Michael's twin. The date scrawled at the bottom said 20 years ago. I felt a chill settle deep in my bones. The lake in the picture was full, the water sparkling under the sun, but there was something unsettling about the couple's smiles. Something forced, like they knew a secret they couldn't share. Throughout the day, more strange things happened. Our watches showed different times, and our phones couldn't agree on the hour. The sun seemed to hang in the sky longer than it should have, as if time itself had gotten stuck. By late afternoon, we were both on edge. The air was too still, the leaves rustling without any wind. I kept glancing at the dried lake bed, half expecting to see the water return, but it remained barren. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a figure appeared at the edge of the campground. A ranger, or at least that's what he looked like, with an old-fashioned uniform that seemed out of place. He approached us, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. "You two need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "You shouldn't be here after dark." Michael and I exchanged a glance, and before we could ask him why, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. We ran after him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. It was like he had vanished into thin air. Determined to find answers, we decided to explore the dried lake bed. The ground was cracked beneath our feet, and the air felt heavy, like we were being watched. As we moved further in, we found something buried beneath the dirt. Wooden beams, rusted metal, the remains of what looked like an old building. We kept digging, uncovering more remnants of a forgotten past. An old sign, barely legible, read, "Welcome to Mirage." It dawned on us then, this wasn't just a lake. It had been a town, long ago, before it was flooded to create the lake. The laughter, the splashing, they were echoes of those who had lived here, who had lost everything when the town was swallowed by water. Then Michael found another Polaroid, half buried in the dirt. It was the same couple, standing in the same spot, but their expressions had changed. Their smiles were gone, replaced by fear, and behind them the water was rising, creeping up towards their feet. My hands shook as I held the photo. "Michael, we need to go," I said, my voice breaking. He looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes, too. We turned and ran back to our campsite, but something had changed. The air was colder, the sky darker than it should have been. Our car wouldn't start, the engine sputtering before dying completely. Panic set in, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on us, the past refusing to let us go. In the distance, I saw them, the couple from the photos, standing at the edge of the dried lake, watching us. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. Michael grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the road. We ran, the sound of laughter and splashing echoing behind us, growing louder with every step. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. Somehow, we made it to the main road, flagging down a passing car. The driver, an older woman, looked at us like she had seen a ghost. "You shouldn't be out here," she said, her voice trembling. We didn't argue. We climbed into her car, and as she drove away, I looked back one last time. The campground was gone. No tents, no car, no lake bed, just an empty field, stretching out into the darkness. The next day, we tried to piece together what had happened, but nothing made sense. The locals refused to talk about Lake Mirage, their faces going pale at the mention of it. We left as soon as we could, the sense of unease never quite leaving us. The Polaroids were gone, vanished along with the lake, but the feeling remained, a weight in my chest, a certainty that we had come too close to something we weren't meant to find. The couple, the town, the lake. They were all connected, a story that had been repeating itself for decades, waiting for someone to listen. Maybe we were just the latest chapter, a new set of faces in an old, tragic tale. Or maybe we had broken the cycle by by refusing to stay. All I knew was that I would never forget the sound of that laughter, echoing across the empty lake, or the way the couple had looked at us, as if they knew exactly what was coming. And as Michael and I drove away from Lake Mirage, the road stretching out before us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been given a second chance, a chance to leave the past behind before it pulled us under too. Story 5. I'm Emily Clark, a 38-year-old journalist from Chicago. After finalizing my divorce, I decided to drive to my sister's place in Vermont to start fresh. The open road felt like the kind of blank slate I needed, miles of distance between me and the life I was leaving behind. The air was crisp, the first hint of autumn in the breeze, and I tried to let the drive clear my mind, to focus on what lay ahead instead of what I was leaving behind. It was at a rest stop somewhere in Ohio that I found it, an unopened letter resting on a weathered picnic table. The envelope was plain, creased at the edges, with the words, "To whoever finds this," scrawled across the front. I hesitated for a moment, my curiosity warring with my sense of caution. But in the end, the journalist in me won out. I picked it up, slid my finger under the flap, and pulled out the letter inside. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. The letter was a plea for help, the writer claiming they were being followed, that they feared for their life. There were no names, no details, just a sense of desperation that made my chest tighten. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching, but the rest stop was empty. The wind rustled the leaves, the only sound breaking the stillness. I folded the letter back into the envelope, an uneasy feeling settling in my stomach. Back on the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The letter sat on the passenger seat, a silent reminder of the stranger's fear. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I noticed a black SUV in my rearview mirror. It had been behind me for a while, keeping pace, mirroring my turns and exits. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that I was letting the letter get to me. But as the miles passed, the unease grew, a knot of fear tightening in my chest. By the time I reached a small roadside motel, the sky was dark and the SUV was still there, parked a few spaces down. I checked in, the receptionist barely looking at me as he handed over the key. But when he saw the letter in my hand, his demeanor changed. His eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his voice low. "You need to get rid of that," he said, his gaze darting to the window. "Whatever it is, just throw it away." I frowned, confusion and fear swirling inside me. "Why?" I asked. But he shook his head, refusing to say more. I took the key and headed to my room, the letter feeling heavier in my hand. That night I woke to a knock at the door. My heart leapt into my throat and I sat up, straining to hear. Another knock, louder this time. I crept to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. I pulled it open, but there was no one there, just the empty parking lot, the black SUV still sitting in the shadows. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The letter was there, slipped under the door, and there was new writing scrawled across the bottom. "You can't escape." Panic surged through me and I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. I grabbed my phone, dialing my sister's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt trapped, the walls of the small motel room closing in around me. I had to know what was happening. I stormed down to the front desk, the letter clutched in my hand. The receptionist looked up, his face pale. "Please," I said, my voice shaky. "Tell me what's going on." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Anyone who reads the letter becomes the next target," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's like a curse. Whoever wrote it, they pass their fear onto you. And now it won't stop until it gets what it wants." My mind raced, the pieces clicking into place. The black SUV, the knock at the door, the feeling of being watched. It was all connected. My hands shook as I looked at the letter, the words blurring on the page. And then it hit me. The handwriting. I knew it. It was his, my ex-husband's. The realization was like a punch to the gut, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. He had always been controlling, manipulative, unwilling to let go. This was his way of tormenting me, of making sure I never escaped him. The fear, the helplessness, it was all his design. I left the motel that night, the letter burning in the trash can behind me. I drove without stopping, the road stretching out endlessly before me, my hands gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I knew I couldn't let the fear take hold, couldn't let him win. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, I felt a glimmer of hope. I was still here, still moving forward. And no matter how hard he tried, I would find a way to start over, to be free. When I finally reached my sister's house, she hugged me tight, her warmth grounding me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that the shadows of my past would linger, but I also knew that I had the strength to face them, to keep moving forward, 1 mile at a time.